Hi everyone, I'm Brooke Barton and I'll be moderating today's live stream Series 2020 digital program. I'm the VP of Innovation here at Series. For those of you who don't know us, Series is a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies to address the greatest challenges of our time, including the climate crisis, deforestation, water scarcity, and human rights. Before we begin today's program, I would like to share our heartfelt sympathy for the family and friends of George Floyd. Series stands in solidarity with the Black community and the protesters in our streets who are challenging systemic racism. As an organization dedicated to building a just and sustainable future, we realize that eliminating racial injustice is crucial to creating the kind of future we seek. Our hearts also go out to everyone affected by the ongoing impacts of the pandemic. We're especially grateful to those working so hard to ensure we are staying healthy and safe. And we look forward to working with investors, companies, and policymakers in the coming months to ensure that we build back better and support a climate-smart and socially just economic recovery. And indeed, some of the solutions for doing just that will be the focus of today's conversation. Project Drawdown Scenario 2 lays out actionable, readily available solutions and technologies for containing climate change to a rise of no more than 1.5 degrees. Our discussion today will look at some of the most impactful solutions in this scenario, such as food production and energy procurement, and very critically, the financing that will be necessary to scale these solutions. I would like to take a moment now just to highlight and say how much we appreciate the generous commitment and support of our speakers and sponsors who have stood by us as we've reimagined the Series 2020 conference. Before we begin with today's session, I have just a few housekeeping notes to share. Please do note, of course, that this session is being recorded and we will be providing all of you with a link to the recording afterwards. If you have any questions for speakers throughout the conversation today, please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel. We'll do our best to answer as many of these questions as possible towards the end of the session. Please note there's always a potential that due to bandwidth issues, we may experience some challenges. If that does happen, the discussion will pause for just 30 seconds or so to allow for the bandwidth to catch up. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Joining us today, we have Karen Fang, Managing Director and Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Bank of America. In her role, Karen leads the bank's efforts to help customers and clients navigate the transition to a low-carbon, sustainable economy. As part of this, the bank is committed to mobilizing an additional $300 billion in capital over the next 10 years for sustainable business activities. Also joining us is Dr. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is a nonprofit that seeks to help us reach drawdown, that future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases stop climbing and start to steadily decline. The organization has very recently released its first major update to its 2017 bestseller on climate solutions. And if you haven't already, I heartily recommend that you look at this new report. It's not only a rigorous synthesis of the science available on climate solution, but it's also beautifully written. And for me, at least at this moment of time, it's been a source of some important and serious inspiration. Finally, we have Rebecca Moses, Head of Impact Strategy at Impossible Foods. Impossible Foods is a company with an unambiguous goal: to drastically reduce humanity's impact on the global environment by completely replacing the use of animals as a food production technology. That's some mission. In recent years, this alt-meat insurgent has changed the mind and eating habits of many a dubious carnivore, including many in my family. And as of last week, the company's products are now available for purchase by consumers through direct delivery, something I am personally very excited about, Rebecca. So I'm going to turn now to our speakers, and I want to start with you, John. Let's start with the Drawdown report that was released just a month or so ago. What are the new insights from your research?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Yeah, as you mentioned, Project Drawdown back in 2017 wrote a book that became a pretty big bestseller called Drawdown, that really just took a landscape review look at all of the possible climate solutions that we could look at that were actually in the real world. These weren't things that were science fiction or in a laboratory somewhere. These were real solutions available at scale, at some scale at least, today. And what we did is we analyzed kind of how big these solutions could be and what they would cost, both initially and over time. So we looked at kind of the overall kind of physics, if you will, of the solution, as well as the economics. We just now in 2020 released a major new update, and we're going to do that every year from now on, actually, because these things change a lot every couple of years, mostly because the technology is improving or our understanding of these solutions is changing. So if your audience is interested, this thing called a Drawdown Review, you can get for free. You don't even have to buy a book. You can download it for free at drawdown.org. So I encourage you to do that. What we've done is we've looked across, again, kind of a landscape of solutions that currently do exist. More will come along as technology and innovation materializes, of course, but we've looked at solutions in the electricity sector, which is really important, food, agriculture, and land use, which is also critically important. In fact, both food and electricity are equal contributors to climate change on a global scale. They're both responsible for about a quarter of climate change emissions. So we have to look at those two, and that's about half of the climate problem is just electricity and food. The other half is mostly made up of things from industry and transportation and buildings. So, I love the audience to kind of remember that if they can, the 5 biggest contributors to climate change, which is 90% of the problem comes from only 5 things: electricity, food, industry, transportation, and buildings. But we also looked at the other side of the equation where nature currently absorbs about 40% of the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions each year of CO2, methane, and the rest. And those are mainly found in things like forest and in the oceans. So we looked across a lot of these different sectors and analyzed individual technologies and found that it is still possible, barely, but it is still physically and economically possible to keep the world from rising above 1.5 degrees. And we can do it with technologies we have now, but again, barely, and we have to get started in a massive scale very, very soon. And we don't need any fancy accounting tricks. We don't need like the bioenergy and carbon capture technology to make it work. We don't need fancy direct air capture machines. In fact, these don't even exist at scale yet, so we didn't even include them. So with some really heroic work in electricity, especially, but also especially in the food system, and especially how we manage forest, we found that those were some of the biggest levers to climate change solutions. We also found some kind of surprising things, like we did in the original book, that some very small gases called fluorinated gases have a very disproportionate role, what we call kind of super pollutants. Reminding us it's not just CO2 that contributes to climate change, but also methane, nitrous oxide, and this whole family of fluorinated gases that we use as refrigerants and industrial chemicals. But I also want to focus on a little bit later, maybe we'll talk about this, the role of things like health and education as kind of a domino effect climate solution. Health and education, it directly doesn't affect climate, but it sets the conditions in society where we can affect climate change for positive ways much better. So the bottom line here is there's no silver bullet to climate change at all. We have a lot of, it's a tired cliche, but we have a lot of silver buckshot. And when we put together in the order of 80 solutions or so, we can just barely, if we start immediately, really address climate change. But the things that we need to, and we'll talk about this later, I suspect, we really have to look at all those sectors: electricity and transport and buildings, of course, all the energy related stuff. But we have to look very carefully at the food system. We have to look very carefully at forest and natural climate solutions. We have to look at the oceans, and we have to look at things like health and education too. There's no one way to solve climate change. We have to do everything to solve climate change. And it will require a lot of capital and a lot of investment along the way, as well as policy and culture change to make this possible.
Right, and John, I appreciate you saying that this is going to take some heroic work, right? This is not, us sitting around and watching it happen. We all have to play a role in it. But what struck me in reading the report was some of the financial analysis. And I'll just read what I recall from that, saying that overall, the net operational savings from implementing these solutions exceed net implementation costs on an order of 4 to 5 times over. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you got to these ranges, and maybe what does it mean?
Yeah, well, the good news is a lot of the things we do that contribute to climate change are antiquated and are kind of bad ideas. For example, almost everywhere in these systems, we find huge opportunities for cost savings and efficiency. In the energy sectors, for example, we talk a lot about, solar power and wind, and we should, how we produce electricity or how we charge our cars and power our buildings. Absolutely. But we also have enormous opportunities for savings, even with our current system through energy efficiency. We have crazy leaky buildings still all over the world. We have, incredibly inefficient transportation systems. We'll talk, I think, a little bit about food waste later, when a third of the food in the world, roughly speaking, is not even eaten by anybody. These are economic disasters, and we accept them as the norm today. They shouldn't exist. So a lot of the low-hanging fruits are just like, stop being stupid. That's the first rule of climate change. Stop doing really dumb stuff. And then the other thing is, like, a lot of the other technologies that we could use to produce electricity, produce nutrition and food, don't have to be the way we did it before. We have, we're burning coal to make electricity. That's insane. We don't need to do that. Solar and wind are now cheaper than coal. They're cheaper than a lot of forms of natural gas, cheaper than nuclear. So we have a better technology. I forget who said it first, but I mean, I've heard Amory Lovins say it, maybe I said before that, but the old quote of, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. I think similarly, we'll see disruptions in the food sector, led by like Impossible and other companies who are giving us, kind of meat alternatives that are far more environmentally friendly in some ways. And there are lots of innovations in the way we farm that could be applied too. So I think it's partly, let's stop wasting what we use and let's make it better. So what we found is that between those two things, we could find enormous opportunities for ROI, huge opportunities, but we have to look at the long term. Again, our analysis is looking over about 30 years, from 2020 to 2050 or so. So that's kind of the long view. And maybe a lot of the problem is we don't take that long view. And when it comes to everyday decision making in companies or in investment firms, sometimes we take too short a view, and that's why we're kind of trapped on this treadmill of doing the same old dumb things when we know better. And if we took the long view, we'd actually make money, create jobs, make a healthier, better planet with more equity, more justice, and avert disastrous climate change. And I should mention too, that figure you mentioned, for every dollar we invest now, we'll get like $3 to $5 back by fixing climate change. That doesn't even account for the damages severe climate change would do if we don't do anything. And that could be untold trillions of dollars. Well, it's incalculable. So this is the biggest bargain in human history, and it's staring us in the face. And we're beginning to realize that, but we should have been realizing that decades ago and gotten started earlier.
Yeah, John, you put this so well, and I think on this topic of myopia, I think we've seen the climate movement of myopia around the fact that we absolutely need to advance these solutions with, a focus on equity and a just transition. And I just wondered if there's anything in your research that speaks to that.
Yeah, it's something that I think the environmental community has to really think much more about. We've been thinking about it, but want to redouble our efforts, of course. Some of the solutions we focused on already, for example, are very connected to health and education gaps we see around the world. The opportunity to get good health care or primary education. There's still a huge gap along economic, racial, and especially gender lines in many countries. If we close that gap, that's an enormously helpful precondition to addressing climate change. We also find, for example, that indigenous communities that maintain their own forest, the forests there tend to be much healthier, more diverse, and they sequester more carbon. So who knew that helping indigenous communities protect land and have secure land tenure is a climate solution? But it is. And going the other way, we find that a lot of climate solutions, of course, can help us with things like public health and potentially equity and justice if we think about them the right way. From a direct health point of view, burning fossil fuels, of course, contributes to major health maladies around the world, especially through air pollution. And those are disproportionately visited upon the most poor and vulnerable peoples of the world. But similarly, tearing down rainforest can also kind of release, if you will, unleash viruses that were naturally tucked away in an ecosystem somewhere where there weren't a lot of people. And then they get unleashed into a human population that has no immunity to this virus. The coronavirus is a different kind of case, but a lot of the emerging infectious diseases we've seen come from tearing down rainforest or the wild animal trade or from really bad forms of animal agriculture, all of which we'd want to get rid of for climate change, and they have a health benefit too.
Right.
So again, this is probably the biggest opportunity in human history to build a better world. And it's also the biggest, catastrophe if we don't. So I think the decision couldn't be more clear that to build a world that we all want, with more jobs, more opportunity, more security, and more sustainability. We have the tools we need right now. And that's what Drawdown tries to point out, that the solutions we need for climate change are here now. They'll make us money, they'll create jobs, they'll build a better world, and we can start today. Of course, better technologies and other things will come along, but what we need now is to move quickly. My colleagues often like to say, now is better than new. We should start with what we have now, because what we don't have is time. That's the one commodity we can't afford to waste.
That's right. And John, I want to turn it over to Rebecca, because I think the founder of Impossible Foods has been very clear about not having time and about having a very kind of disruptive vision for the business. And certainly one of the things that the Drawdown work brings into stark relief is just how important land, agriculture, and food is, both as a source of emissions and a sink. So Rebecca, I'm just wanted to hear from your perspective, do you feel like the kind of environmental community or the finance community has sort of been shortchanging the role of the food system in addressing climate?
I think that we're seeing a shift in that. I think that work like what the Drawdown report is doing, and really what this is showing, is the deep connection between climate, between land use, and the intersection with our food system. So when we talk about things like emissions and deforestation, we're starting to see a more popular recognition and understanding that these things are very much linked. But the really core driver of much of this is, in fact, the way that we produce food, especially the way that we rely on animals and dairy products. So these just inefficiencies of animal metabolism that we're working with. If there's one thing that I really want to articulate about Pat Brown's vision, our company was founded in 2011 by our CEO and founder, Dr. Pat Brown, who came out of academia. He was a biochemist. He was not someone who was particularly interested in food manufacturing. He's not a foodie by any stretch of the imagination. He really founded the company specifically to be a transformative toolkit for addressing climate issues, and especially biodiversity issues. And those things very much intersect, especially when it comes to land use. And so the motive of the company is, look, we need to provide consumer-facing options rather than trying to convince people to be aware of these issues. So all of the reporting, all of the science, all of these problems, they've been diagnosed. What we're missing on the food side is actual solutions to divert consumer behavior away from very, very high resource intensity products like beef, like milk, like any number of animal proteins, and into something that's much more efficient and plant-based. And so fundamentally what we have is a product that can be accessible across the world, across the United States. We're in all 50 states now. We've been able to scale up very quickly, although we have a tremendous amount of scaling that's still needing to happen, and the financing that goes with that. But this is a negative emissions technology in the most technical sense of the word. This is something where, as John mentioned, I like this idea of this isn't science fiction. A lot of the climate conversation talks about how do we pull carbon out of the atmosphere with direct air capture or carbon scrubbers. The most effective way we can do this is photosynthesis, and that's a technology that's been perfected over billions of years. But in order to do that, we need to address food systems that are creating the agricultural landscape to encroach onto forests, to encroach into grasslands, and the increasing global demand for meat is going to accelerate that trend. So instead of using land to create methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions, is there a way that we can address consumer behavior to take that land instead and allow it to be spared, allow it to go back to the business of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere through grasslands and forests? So I'm heartened to see that there is more attention being paid to this, but I think that the real key here is going to be scaling up the consumer tools, things like Impossible Burger, the products that we will be rolling out, and the rest of the plant-based industry that's really creating feasible, consumer adoptable alternatives to these other products.
Yeah, and Rebecca, maybe you could just drill down for us. I mean, you're the head of Impact, so I know you've measured this. So, for somebody who would ordinarily eat a beef burger for lunch, what does it mean from an environmental perspective when they opt for the Impossible instead?
Right, and so I'll tell you in per pound, when you, and again, these numbers aren't perfect, we rely on an LCA, so we're making pretty conservative estimates here. But for every pound of Impossible Burger that is consumed instead of beef from a cow in the United States, you're sparing about 300 square feet of land in a year. You're sparing about 30 pounds of carbon equivalents and about 90 gallons of water. Additionally, there's water pollution savings in the form of aquatic eutrophication and any number of other indicators that we could talk about. Now, at a per person level, that is significant in of itself, but it's really meaningful when you look at a national scale. And that's why it was so important for us to make sure that we were producing a product that wasn't just for certain segments of the world, that wasn't just for certain consumer groups. We needed to be very, very sure that carnivores, people who are hardcore meat eaters, omnivores, people who actually demand meat in their diet, that this is what they're choosing. Vegans and vegetarians are really already kind of eating low on the food chain. They're doing the right thing for climate, for biodiversity preservation. We wanted to put this in the hands of the folks who would be able to move the needle. And what we've seen is about a 90% of our consumer base is in fact self-identified meat eaters, which is great. That's tremendous proof of concept for us. And it's the reason that we've been so bullish on becoming very accessible and as ubiquitous as we possibly can in as short a period of time as we can, and pushing forward on new products in addition.
Yes, we're all waiting for the Impossible Pork to hit the market. I know that's the next big product line, right?
Stay tuned.
So, well said. And Karen, let's shift to you and let's look at the world of finance and the role it has to play here. We've seen that ESG-linked securities over the past several years have been mostly focused on green bonds or other types of green financing, focusing on sectors like energy. But recently, we saw the bank issued a social bond focused entirely on COVID-19 for the healthcare industry. Just generally, what is the opportunities that you see in this moment in time for sustainable finance to play a role in our recovery and helping the economy and the society build back better?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel with John and you and Rebecca. And I think that's a very important question because I do think everything, requires capital to run, and everything does run on money behind the scenes or up front and center. So finance does play a very important role in society because we touch so many corporate clients, individual clients. Obviously, there's all stakeholders are involved in the climate solution. So when you think about the green bonds that you spoke about, Brooke, Bank of America is the #1 green bond underwriter in the world. We actually have underwritten over the last 7 years over $200 billion of green bonds, targeting primarily renewable energy and EV and energy efficiency that John and Rebecca both spoke about. $200 billion for 150 clients, including governments, agencies, and corporates. And now we are turning our focus a little bit into becoming the top underwriter of social bonds. And you talked about the COVID-19 social bond that we just issued. It's $1 billion from Bank of America. But in addition to issuing from our own balance sheet, we have helped several governments, agencies, and corporations issue now at about $25 billion and counting. Our bond is focused on lending to the healthcare industry. So our $1 billion is used to lend to nonprofit hospitals, skilled nursing facilities, and the manufacturers and suppliers of healthcare equipment and testing and PPEs and so on and so forth. But we also have helped many other issuers use the proceeds to really help society get testing, get diagnostics and treatment, also making sure we support the people and the company and really the societal constituents that are on the front line. So that $25 billion is no small feat. Why? Because for those of you that have followed the ESG-linked securities world, green bonds have absolutely been dominant. And social bonds have been hard to structure, hard to distribute, and hard to finance. And that's the change that I'm very, very hopeful for, that this year, the 2020, the very unfortunate healthcare crisis that have put the world in a lockdown is finally going to put social financing on the map. And that is healthcare, education, water conservation, and many, many of the important solutions that Project Drawdown even talked about, that historically largely relied on government funding, public sector funding, philanthropic funding. But I think private sector now is coming in and joining the fight. And capital markets provides a very important avenue for that capital to join in together. So I think the E is very important. The S is equally important. And social inequality and things that we're dealing with right now in the States. And I think our CEO talked about not let this quiet down. So social equality, community development progress for the Black community, for the Hispanics community, all minorities. And, I think very importantly, John talked about health and education for women and underprivileged communities. Those are all linked back to climate solutions. So our main focus for 2020 and beyond is to bring social financing to the forefront and really develop this avenue of private sector capital to joining the government capital and philanthropic capital to really make sure we deliver the E and the S in the ESG together. I'll pause
Great,
there.
thank you, Karen. John, let's go back to talking about some of the solutions here that we touched upon. I mean, I think the sectors of wind and solar energy have been identified, as you noted, as some of the biggest that we need to tackle. How are you feeling about current trends in wind and solar development? What's going to be necessary to really take this to scale?
Yeah, of all the sectors that contribute to climate change, electricity is kind of leading the way. Again, the production of electricity today globally is about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a quarter of the problem. Again, reminder, we still have 3/4 to go. But a quarter of this is in electricity. And it's both the kind of push and the pull that's happening in electricity is where we're making so much progress. In the United States, in fact, electricity shifts in electricity away from coal towards natural gas, but better towards renewables, is really leading the way of why the US, a lot of people don't know this, but we peaked our emissions in this country in 2007. They're already 15% below that, and this year they're going to be dramatically below that for very bad reasons. But the trends are clear. And right now, the price per megawatt hour of solar and wind is now cheaper than coal and a lot of forms of natural gas, and certainly cheaper than nuclear, at least previous generations of nuclear power. So it's clearly the way to go. Unfortunately, those solar and wind, while growing kind of exponentially and incredibly well, and now because it's just cheaper than the alternative, it's going to win, it's clear. But we still have some problems about the grid itself. How do we dispatch energy where it's needed, when it's needed, reliably? Questions of storage, questions of overbuilding. If you can't be sure it's going to be perfectly sunny every day, then you need to build maybe 300% production capacity instead of 100% just to hedge. But solar is so cheap, why not? So of all the sectors that contribute to climate change, I think electricity is kind of in the best shape. And if climate change were only caused by making electricity, I'd be really hopeful because, wow, we're actually changing it about on track that what we need. The real problem is all the other sectors, food, industry, transportation, and buildings. Those are not moving nearly as fast as electricity is. A lot of them use electricity, they're interconnected, and part of the transportation solution would be to shift to electrified vehicles and so on. But electricity is leading the way. What I'm worried about is what's going to be following. Where are the innovations in, like building efficiency? How do we retrofit every building in the world? What are the innovations in agriculture and food waste? We've heard of some today, but we need a lot more. What are the innovations in things like making steel and cement and all that? A lot of the answers are electrification, but not all of them. So we have a long way to go, but the tip of the spear in solving climate change right now seems to be renewable electricity. It's been a really good kind of vanguard of that solution, but it needs to move faster. And we also need to reduce emissions through efficiency measures everywhere we can. We still waste enormous amounts of energy and food and other resources on this planet. And that's, as Drawdown shows, about half of what we need to do is just stop wasting what we currently produce, as well as producing it in a better way. So electricity is a good model, but it needs to move faster, and everything else in the world needs to kind of follow the same almost Moore's law rate of change in that kind of technology, just to kind of keep up with what we need to do to address climate change at 1.5 degrees.
That makes sense. Well, Karen, Bank of America, as I noted at the top, has committed $300 billion over the next 10 years to sustainable business activities. This is in addition to, I think, $158 billion that you guys have already deployed. Can you talk about what the bank is doing to drive more growth and investment in, clean energy, clean transportation, relative to, the portfolio that is maybe more in your traditional industries?
Absolutely. So we actually achieved that 158 billion, which was divided into two different goals. Achieved that goal sort of 4 or 5 years early. So this 300 billion, hopefully we can achieve before 2030 as well. So we were actually the top lender in the renewable industry in North America. So when you look at wind and solar that you and John just talked about, we're very, very dominant in terms of really focus on the financing of these projects from greenfield to brownfield, and really start, from the construction phase to sort of more mature projects and restructuring of all of those projects in the utility scale wind and solar, and also in the residential solar space. What we're doing specifically is really to expand into community solar, into commercial industrial solar solutions, battery storage solutions. And we were pretty big in EV space, and right now we're really exploring EV leases in addition to EV auto loans. So maybe it's getting too much detail, but we really are focused on the 5 elements that John was talking about in terms of electricity, in terms of transportation, industry, food and agriculture, and buildings. And a lot of the work that we have done is not only to really do financings of these different projects, but also really educate our clients. So our CEO, Brian Moynihan, is the chairman of the IBC, which is the 130 largest companies in the world. And a lot of work has been done with the World Economic Forum in terms of really kind of forcing or peer pressuring companies to declare net zero targets. And that's obviously in line with what EU is asking member states and companies to do. And that is very important because you see companies one after another coming out with carbon neutrality goals. And we ourselves are leading by example, because you can't tell other people to do it without doing it yourself. So again, we were ahead of schedule by achieving scope 1 and 2 emissions neutrality in December of 2019. And that was a goal that we were going to achieve in 2020. So it's very important to be able to do that. Now we're going to all of our corporate clients, that tens of thousands of companies that we bank, to say it's really important for Paris Agreement, for your individual carbon footprint, for your supply chains, for your customer, because your customers demand it. And obviously we all only have one planet. We have to collectively address the climate issue. And climate issue is a social issue. And people realize if you're better, in ESG performance, in your carbon solutions, and in declaring these goals, your shareholders and stakeholders do applaud that. And it does translate to the company bottom line. So the work we're doing is not just by putting money to work or distributing green social bonds, but also really about education. I think a lot of companies want to do good. They don't know how. They don't understand what scope 1, 2, 3, greenhouse gas emissions definition. They don't know what to do about energy efficiency upgrades, about changing source energy to renewable, about how they can purchase potentially carbon offsets to offset the unavoidable emissions. That education work is as important as the financing work that we're doing, and that's what we're committed to.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. It's a long journey and a lot of conversations to be had, and I know everyone who's on this webinar and who are in the audience are engaged in many of those conversations with large companies about being on this journey to set net zero. And I think just, it's difficult to do things like quantify scope 3 emissions for a bank, but maybe it's not so difficult to be able to talk about how many of your customers have become net zero, have commitments themselves. So, I think that is the kind of conversation that we hope drives to the kind of visible leadership and hopefully a race to the top where all the banks are looking to have customers that are aligned with Paris. So thanks for sharing that. And I wanted to kind of talk really practically with Rebecca about, this question of financing. Is financing, access to finance, a barrier for a company like Impossible? Are you feeling like you're getting any kind of preferential finance based on the kind of vision that you're bringing to the conversation, or maybe the barriers are somewhere else? It'd be just helpful to get your perspective on that, Rebecca.
Yeah, we have a really large and ambitious mission in front of us. And in order to achieve that, we're certainly going to require financing. And we've been really fortunate to sit where we are, kind of at the intersection of this really high tech growth company and environmental and social impact in the ESG space. So while we're addressing one of the most, one of the largest accessible markets, which is livestock, which is about $1 trillion globally or a little bit over, we have to achieve the necessary scale that will allow us to approach the entirety of that market, which is a very, very large one. So the impact that we plan on having is not necessarily going to be measured over a 5-year P&L. And I think that the investment community is starting to realize that we need to allow ESG companies to benefit from potentially lower costs of capital, although that is not something that I can speak to in terms of whether it has been our model. But the reason for that is that the demand for our products and the demand for plant-based alternatives globally is going to really exceed the capabilities that we have right now and that our whole industry has right now to meet them. And that ranges from manufacturing to sales to any number of other types of infrastructure or inputs to really achieve that level of creation of alternatives that we need in order to bring our food system within boundaries, within planetary boundaries, and to facilitate, at the worst, a 1.5 degree raise. I think that we can be even more ambitious than that if we do this right as an industry. So the more we can quickly scale those areas of business as an industry, the better and faster and larger impact we can have on the environment in a very positive way. I think it's worth noting that, similar to Karen's point, the core, like Bank of America, our core product is helping our customers really manifest that and really achieve that. The muscle that we're going to be able to flex on Paris Agreement commitments is not housed within our own operations. It is in serving and providing alternatives and tools for consumers across the world and for our customers, whether they're retailers, whether they're food service. But the inputs necessary to scale that so aggressively will continue to need additional financing. And we've been very lucky with what we've been able to raise so far, which is about $1.2 billion with a $500 million round close in March. So these are very tough economic times, but we're well placed right now to continue to advance the mission.
I'm happy to hear that. Karen, did you want to talk a little bit about the bank's focus on the food and agriculture sector and how that intersects with some of these issues?
Absolutely. So first of all, Rebecca, I'm dying to try the direct purchase. So I think that's great that I don't even have to go to the grocery store to buy your product. But we also are very honored to have helped Impossible raise that equity round that Rebecca just talked about in Q1. And we are very, very focused on really strengthening our capabilities in the food and agriculture sector. For one, I think a lot of people don't really know the 5 components that John talked about. That food and agriculture really represents 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. I think that's a data that shocks a lot of people. So I think the education again there has been very important, but really supporting companies like Impossible. We supported companies that are doing vertical farming, supported companies that are doing locally grown sort of products, which obviously kind of reduce the transportation needs as well. So I think a lot of those things are important. Those companies need capital. Impossible is in a better position than many other smaller companies. And even when we looked at the capital raising for Impossible, there are tons and tons of interest and demand from ESG-minded investors. I am very encouraged when you talk about these financings and you talk about the social bonds that we just spoke about in healthcare, and we did a education social bond for Pearson to, for example, to develop more online training for children around the world in the pandemic and thereafter, because I think education is changing. And we have to obviously help produce more of those content, and that content can democratize education, right? So when you look at the healthcare social bond, you look at the Impossible type of innovative food technology type of capital, you look at the education social financing. The next one we're actually focused on is brain health, mental health, because unfortunately that's the next frontier after the COVID crisis, as unfortunately we can all predict. A lot of these causes, historically, if you asked me 5 years ago, I've been on Wall Street for 22 years, if you asked me 5 years ago that each of these offerings will be on average 3 to 5 times oversubscribed, I would have not believed it. But the education bond was 13 times oversubscribed, and the COVID bonds were on average 7 times oversubscribed, and there was tons and tons of interest in Rebecca's company. So it just goes to say, John said this is the biggest bargain. I think it's a great deal for investors, and the investors are forming these funds, and they have a lot of interest, not just because it's the right thing to do, but it does perform. And I think their limited partners, their investors are asking for it. If you're a pension fund, your pensioners are requesting, you look at the ESG and sustainability strategy. If you are an insurance company, your clients are asking for. If you're an asset manager, your investors absolutely demand it. So I think the trend is good. And I think we're actually going to see more of it. And I think our job is to really be that link between supply and demand, do a very good job developing this market and bring solutions into all of these issues. And they're all linked, right? Because, you know, a carbon sequestration solution is a biodiversity solution, is an employment solution, is a climate solution. So I think our job in the food and agriculture sector, very quickly to summarize, is in reducing food waste and throughout the entire chain, but also really in contributing to changing food behavior, starting with our own 208,000 employees and our supply chains and our clients and our shareholders and stakeholders, but also really thinking about changing agriculture, you know, practices, looking at preserving land, mangroves, and a lot of the natural carbon sinks, if you will, in the nature, as well as looking at how do we protect better ecosystem. One of the most important projects that we have taken on in my business at Bank of America for sustainable finance is really develop a very robust voluntary carbon offset trading and financing business. Because I think that is the key solution for all unavoidable emissions. When you go through the journey of energy efficiency, changing renewable energy, changing behavior, changing whatever, I still think we're going to have unavoidable emissions. And that's where we want to address the voluntary carbon market, and we can effectively trade it, effectively finance against it, such that we can contribute to a net zero environment.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Well, you mentioned one of the topics that are on the list for Drawdown, and that's food waste. And I wanted to see, John, if you could just give people a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about here in terms of the scale of the issue, and maybe some of the opportunities or technologies that you think have some real promise.
Yeah, it's food waste in some ways is the most relatable climate solution because we encounter it 3 times a day on average, right? In our own homes and everything else. But when you think about going from the farmer's field ultimately to the dinner plate and then to the landfill, there's so many places where food is lost or wasted along the supply chain. In rich countries, a lot of the waste happens near us, the consumers, in kind of the, you know, supermarkets, restaurants, cafeterias, homes, our refrigerators, and so on. But in poorer countries, a lot of food is lost from the farmer getting into the marketplace. Maybe it just got spoiled in storage or never made it onto the truck or whatever. So it's a kind of a leaky system that leaks a lot of food along the way from the farmer's field to our bellies, if you will. So what's really sad is today, because we've really ignored food waste as an issue in many ways, about 1/3 roughly of all the food produced in the world is lost. It depends, of course, do you measure that in dollars, do you measure that in pounds, do you measure that in calories or whatever? It varies a little bit, but roughly about 1/3. So if you think about that, that means, you know, do the math, 1/3 of the land we use to grow food wasn't actually necessary if we got rid of food waste, or 1/3 of the carbon emitted, 1/3 of the water used, 1/3 of the biodiversity impacted, 1/3 of everything the food system does isn't even useful if we could get rid of that waste. So first and foremost, we should find ways to kind of plug those leaks in the food system wherever we can. And disproportionately, though, it gets to not only how much we waste, but what we waste. As Rebecca pointed out very, very well, meat products, especially beef and dairy products, especially too, are especially impactful. So wasting a pound of hamburger, for example, is like wasting 30 pounds of corn, let's say. So we really have to target the kind of meat and dairy products, especially for food waste. And this is where like an Impossible Foods or others has kind of a double whammy effect of one, if you lose a pound of Impossible Burger versus a pound of beef burger, it's a huge difference in the environmental impact. But also, I think some of these plant-based foods might be able to have a longer shelf life. They might be less wastage from spoilage. They might have better food safety track records down the road. We'll find out. I hope so, and I think so. That's one of the goals, I believe, of the plant-based industry. I'd love to hear Rebecca talk about that. But there might be a lot of opportunities here to reduce food waste, improve food safety and food security, and farmers' incomes, especially in developing countries. What's not to like? The problem is it is kind of a leaky problem. We need some culture change for sure, but we also need some technologies. This is where finance, I think, could be very important. I'd love to see more technology in, in trucks, in shipping containers, in our supermarkets and so on, like little sensors that are sniffing for the metabolic byproduct of fungus or bacteria that are kind of spoiling our food. I'm sure Amazon will come along with an Alexa refrigerator at some point. I don't need my refrigerator to play music for me, but I'd love it to tell me when the milk goes bad, or like, hey, that meat in the back, you might want to eat that now. Or how about smart labels? Aren't we all sick of these stupid labels on food that, sell by, use by? They don't really have a standard meaning, and they often have nothing to do with the state of your current food. Wouldn't it be great to have active sensors that tell you when something is going bad or not? That technology exists, we just haven't invested in it. So I think there's a lot we can do in this space, and it requires innovations from like a Bank of America on the finance side, but also Impossible Foods and many, many others. I'd love to see us tackle food waste as just as important as solar energy is in terms of the climate problem, let's say, or just as important as windmills, just as important as everything else we talk about. But food waste is something we can really tackle and have so many co-benefits if we do it right.
We've heard it here. We need more heroes focusing on food waste. Thank you, John. I am seeing some questions coming in, so I thought it might be good to turn to our questions from the audience. One question I think is coming in that's kind of interesting, and I've certainly heard this before from different folks, which is, why are we so focused on natural, or why do we not focus on natural, quote unquote, natural plant-based foods instead of solutions like the impossible? Is this not analogous to John's argument for focusing on renewables over carbon capture? So I'll let you start off, Rebecca, and then maybe John, you can fill in as well.
It's a really good question, and one that I have to refer back to consumer behavior and what people want to eat versus kind of an ideal end state. So what's realistic as opposed to what ideally might happen. So the first thing I want to address is breaking down the idea of natural versus not natural. If in the food space someone can define what natural means to me, I will be eternally grateful, because I have yet to arrive at a really good answer to that. In terms of our product, it's made of soy protein, potato protein, coconut oil, sunflower oil, our key ingredient heme, which is found in all living organisms. I see it as very much a natural product, but definitions are very subjective. So the reason that the level of investment to scale technologies that can actually be functional equivalents for a consumer, someone who eats meat on a regular basis, someone who is not going to substitute their hamburger for tofu or bean burger or a plate of some other kind of legume-based protein, is because people simply don't behave like that. We've heard the argument of eat less meat in order to achieve a sustainable food future. But if you look at consumption charts globally, that simply isn't happening. And I think we don't have the time to try and ask people or to wait to convince people that this is a necessity. China is a really interesting example of when so several years ago, the centralized government asked people and put out guidance, mostly for health reasons, to eat less red meat. And what happened? Red meat increased, consumption increased. There's no abating demand for these products, especially as emerging economies are leveraging that income to eat the foods that they want to eat, and that the rest of the United States, North America, has had access to these foods for a long time. So we can't expect that people will simply switch beef for beans, because it hasn't proven out, it hasn't happened. But what we have seen is that products like the Impossible Burger, when you can compete on culinary attributes, on taste, on versatility, on nutrition, when you can do that, you can capture these carnivores, and you can actually freeze or even start dropping meat from animal consumption. And that is incredibly important, because if we don't do that, we are going to continue to see the expansion of the agricultural footprint of the planet, which is already, in terms for livestock production alone, is about 50% of the ice-free surface of the planet. That's extensive grazing lands, that's feed crop production. The growth of that footprint is going to come out of forests and the high carbon value, high biodiversity value biomes that we absolutely cannot afford to lose for ecosystem services that keep humans alive, for food security, futures, and resilience. So I think we can't be precious, is what it comes down to. We need the right tools, and we need the financing and the investment and innovation in the right tools that will meet consumers where they're at, rather than expecting kind of an ideal, future that we'd all like to happen, but how do we get there?
Right, and time is short. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, quickly, sometimes there's this weird debate within the meat community. I think people think about meat and climate change as if it's like one solution or the other. The real world is going to be messy. It's going to be all of them at the same time. So some people will give up meat entirely, but not a lot, as Rebecca's pointing out. Some people will shift red meat to white meat, maybe eat less beef and more chicken and pork, which a lot of Americans are doing today. More flexitarians or people eating more fish. Okay, cool, that helps a lot too. Some people join the plant-based meat thing, so that fills a really big need too. And there's also two other levers we're going to pull at the same time, is reducing the waste of meat and dairy products wherever we can, so we don't have to grow more than we actually eat. And then, of course, the remaining beef, that people are still going to eat beef, whether people like it or not. I don't get to decide that. None of us get to decide what everybody else in the world eats. But we can at least try to grow that more sustainably. So there's a lot of interest in regenerative agriculture, especially in beef production. I think these are all friends. These aren't competing with each other. The animal food sector is so enormous, and its impact on the planet is so gigantic, probably more than anything but oil in human history is meat in terms of changing the face of this planet. We really have to take a hard look at it, and I think we'd take it from every angle simultaneously, and these could actually work together. So why not do it?
Absolutely. So I have a question here for you, Karen, which relates to sort of what barriers exist for B of A in setting a net zero target for all of its emissions, including Scope 3, and or another way of thinking about it is that how does B of A achieve drawdown at an organizational level?
Yeah, so I mentioned in December we reached a milestone of becoming carbon neutral in Scope 1 and 2. And that was sort of an effort over the last 6-7 years. First of all, reduce and renew, and so reduce our energy usage, and we actually put on-site solar panels in our financial centers, ATMs, buildings. We looked at EV charging stations for our customers and employees, and we do a lot of different stuff, and LED lighting everywhere, refrigerant solutions. So I think we have done a lot in Scope 1 and 2. I think the challenge, to answer directly, is Scope 3, because that includes employee travel. Is easy. We could do that. We could really. By the way, I do think there is side effect, maybe positive effect of this, is people realizing remote virtual meetings are really productive, and people save a lot of time traveling back and forth. So our emissions are definitely down from employee travel for sure, where 90% of our employees are working from home. I think that will change how we think about the workplace going forward, and especially employee travel. But I think the financed emissions, to answer your question, is a big hurdle. I think there's a lot of different effort, industry alliances, working groups internationally to really think about financed emissions, and do we triple, double count, emissions, and how do we think about that? And that's why it goes into this education work that I talked about, that we have to work with all sectors, the 5 major sectors that John talked about, but obviously all industries, in thinking about how do we reduce, renew, retire, and realign. I think business model needs to be reconsidered in almost every industry. Supply chain needs to be reconsidered, reimagined, and employee and really the community behavior in terms of demand for energy, demand for food, demand for all the different things that we already are used to today, or in the last few decades. How do we really think about reimagine that? So I think the biggest challenge is financed emissions. I think the definition is still not yet clear, and how do you really make sure we don't double, triple count and penalize people at the same time? We all have to be very constructive and proactive about solutions. And I really think this comes down to this realignment and reimagination of how we do business, and how do we affect changing our entire supply chain, which we, as a company of $2.5 trillion in assets, and we spend $53 billion a year as Bank of America in terms of our total expenses. We have a lot of influence on supply chain. So we have to think about that as a responsible corporate leadership. And how do we really change that? And how do we help our clients change all of that?
Great, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I think it's a journey that the finance sector is on, and a lot of tools are emerging, and I think we'll be seeing more from the sector, and we appreciate all that's been done. We have just a few minutes before we wrap up, and I wanted to give everybody a chance to sort of share their speed round, short reflection on what is giving you hope right now as we look at the kind of change that we need to see urgently to actually achieve drawdown in our economy and across our globe. So I'm going to start with you, John.
I guess what has always given me a little bit of hope is, as a kid, everything I was told was impossible, and changes we might want to see in the world turned out to not only be possible, they were inevitable. If you were to tell me as a little kid, like, oh, gay marriage, that would never happen. It's legal in all 50 states. Oh, elect an African-American president, boom, we did it. The end of the USSR, the end of apartheid. Apartheid's such a bad idea, it doesn't even exist on this planet today. So when you tell me that, oh, we can't change the way we make energy, we can't change the way we make food, we can't change the way we build cities, bring it on. Of course we can, we always have. And sometimes we do that in an enlightened way, proactively because we want to, and sometimes because we need to in the face of a crisis. So what's interesting to me is after 2007, we actually, in the US, kind of peaked our emissions, and the economy we rebuilt starting in 2008 was more efficient. We actually have been reducing greenhouse gas emissions ever since 2008 while the economy was rebounding. I think in the face of this current disaster, which is far worse, we might have the opportunity to rethink a lot of what we do, whether it's our travel, whether it's our priorities for our money and our time, our health, and also in terms of social equity. So sometimes in the face of the biggest crises and the biggest, kind of challenges, we can really rise up and find the biggest solutions and the biggest inspiration to make a better world. So that's my hope, is in the face of challenges, we might rise to be a better people.
Karen, do you want to share your quick thoughts before we wrap?
Yeah, so two things very quickly. One is I sort of mentioned this already, that the social financing, this is the year of the social financing finally being put on the map. I think the healthcare, education, these things have been done. If you told me, again, bring health, can that be done? Absolutely. And I think I'm personally just honored and encouraged that, I'm working on a community development progress bond for social equality for our, communities of color. As a minority myself, I just think being able to work on this in mainstream Wall Street finance is just a very encouraging trend. And the investors embracing these instruments is absolutely, it should make everyone feel more optimistic. And technology solutions, I think technological advancement, a lot of that John has talked about. I'm hearing some echo. I think that those are all very exciting things that we want to help finance, we want to help advance and support. So I think we absolutely see our responsibility in supporting the technological advancement in all of these solutions, whether it's climate driven or societal priority driven. So very excited about those and very hopeful.
Thank you, Karen. Rebecca?
I'll try to be brief, and there's two things that first come to mind. Obviously, COVID and the resulting economic and public health impacts of that has been absolutely tragic. But within that, I've seen an unprecedented willingness to invest in solutions and to address a problem. And when we've heard about climate action in the past, I think there's been this kind of collective, oh, it's going to be so much work and so much money. And what we've seen is that with the proper motivation, when we actually think about life and limb, we can collectively, globally lift and figure out how to address it, even if it takes us a little while. But the capability to mobilize is there. And so that gives me some level of optimism. The second, and I'm going to try and not impugn the boomer generation too much when I say this, is that we've been doing some really interesting consumer insights work on environment and on sustainability, trying to talk to general population about what their values are and how they think about food, how they think about planet. And what we've seen from especially the younger generations is a categorical change in how they conceive of kind of collective good and how they think about their impact vis-a-vis kind of a public good or the impacts on the planet, and their willingness to make changes and be conscientious and their overall awareness. And so I'm really motivated by those findings and hearing from people who are millennials, Gen Z, which is not to say that this doesn't exist in the older generations, but the motivation that we've been seeing and that I've noticed and hearing them and how they talk about a future has so much they are so willing to pitch in and figure it out and address challenges in a way that I think is really interesting and pretty novel.
It is exciting to see. It's an important change that we're all depending on as we move forward. And I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation today. I also want to thank our sponsors that you see in the screen who have provided instrumental support for this event. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email with a recording shortly. And for those of you who are continuing on as part of this conference, we have another session tomorrow at noon on how deep ESG investing positions investors for recovery. So we hope you will join us for that and stay in touch. Thank you so much. This session is adjourned.